commercial transactions. Thank you.
Thank you, Denise. My name is Ben Sorrell. I'm an attorney at Schutz and Bowen in Sarasota, doing exclusively commercial transactions, mainly drafting and negotiating purchase and sale agreements for commercial properties, vacant land, as well as commercial lease drafting and negotiation.
Hi, I'm Joe Hembry. I am a commercial real estate broker with Hembry and Associates and co-owner of that business of the same name, and have been practicing actively here in Southwest Florida since 2008, and working with my father, who has been doing it here since 1974. So we've got a little bit of experience here and around the area. Before we move on, I want to give a quick plug for Yarnell. I actually did the deal that put them into their current space. They're in about 45,000 square feet off of Lime Avenue up there, just north of 17th Street, or south of 17th Street, sorry. And they also moved our offices. They moved my father's house, and a good friend of mine, through that senior relocation specialist, they moved, his mother had Alzheimer's, and they moved her out of Bay Plaza and into Sarasota Bay Club in the same day, had her room set up to where she barely understood that she had moved locations, and really improved that experience for them. So I have great things to say about Yarnell, and they do a great job. If you know somebody in that situation, all three of those different things, they did a great job. So thanks, guys, and thanks for being a sponsor.
All
Okay,
right.
let's dive into the
Yeah, so as Denise said, we're going to talk today about commercial transactions, commercial contracts. Obviously, there's a lot we can talk about, and I think Joe and I have tried to make it applicable for those who are versed or are getting versed in the commercial world, or those who are doing more residential and want to get involved with the commercial world. And so we're going to go over some things that we have in the PowerPoint, just some discussion points and some best practices, some highlights. You should have a copy of the CC5 contract. It was on the table out front for a handout.
real quickly, just so the CC5 contract, that's
Yeah.
correct. If you look at the bottom, it should say CC5X. So
Is that
So-
better?
we have a presentation, but we're going to make this kind of conversational and round robin like to some degree, especially we're going to go through the slides and then open it up. Just so we understand who's in the room and where we ought to kind of target and orient the discussion. Who has used a CC5 before? Who has used a CC5 more than 5 times before? So 2. Who has never used a CC5 and or conducted like a commercial transaction before? Okay, so the vast majority of the room. Okay, we just want to understand what we're working from and what baseline we're at. We'll kind of orient towards that direction, and if we're speaking either too high or too below, interrupt us, and we'll reorient and make sure that we're making as much use of this time as possible.
Yeah, and as Joe said, we have some prepared things through the PowerPoint, but I think it's most beneficial to open it up to questions at the end. And, I'll do my best to give any answers that I can for any questions on the commercial contract or commercial transactions in general, and any considerations you should be giving in a commercial transaction versus a residential, because there are, as you'll see, some differences between a commercial transaction versus a residential transaction that you wouldn't think about or consider in a residential. And so the first few slides here talk about the difference between residential and commercial transactions, and these will fall through into the contract as well, with what the commercial contract covers versus what the residential contract, the FAR doesn't cover. And so one of the biggest ones is the duty to disclose. In a commercial transaction, it's caveat emptor. There's no duty to disclose. Obviously, the seller cannot fraud and lie to you if you inquire as the buyer, but otherwise, if you don't ask, the seller is under no affirmative duty to disclose anything about the property, whether it materially affects the value of the property or not. There is no Johnson v. Davis type analysis in a commercial setting. So this is where it becomes really important to get specific representations and warranties in a commercial deal. The contract is, your commercial contract is going to be a tool to try to figure out what are the issues with the property. Because if you ask the seller to make a certain representation or warranty about the property and they don't want to give it to you, that's a red flag that they don't want to make that because they don't have a duty to disclose it. So if they strike that representation that you're asking for from the contract, you have to ask why. And one of the slides we'll get to talks about the quote unquote issues I see with using the CC5. And one of them is that it's basically an as-is contract with no representations or warranties other than you're going to get marketable title. And so if you're doing a sophisticated deal or a long-term deal, you have a buyer that has needs of getting permits and approvals and et cetera, you might want to rethink using the CC5 or at least consulting with an attorney to do some sort of proper addendum to the CC5 so that your client's needs can be met. And so that's one of the biggest differences between residential and commercials is there's no duty, affirmative duty to disclose anything with the property.
Yeah, so speaking to that a little bit too, so I went back before this to try to sort it out and I couldn't figure out the total number of transactions, but it's above 600 or so that I've done over the last 10 years or so and over 400 million in that. I have the first thing up here is like, what kind of contract is it? Is it, do you have a due diligence or is it the as is? And because of what he talked about, out of all of those transactions that I've done, I've only ever had one that was an as is contract. So I've only checked that box one time in my entire career. And the reason is because of what he just said. If you do that and they have marketable title, but it had an environmental issue that could cost millions of dollars to clean up, it's there, right? So it's just not something that is generally done, but it is a very effective contract. Probably 70% of the transactions that I've conducted have been with a CC5. A lot of those, as he just said, have been amended with some kind of addendum that add some caveats or some representations or some estoppels or some other things that we'll get into a little bit later. Yeah, so gas stations commonly have environmental issues. More problematic often is if it was near something that had heavy metals and or like actually gas stations are one of the easier things to clean up. Florida has a very high floodplain. It's actually being downstream from a gas station that's often bad, or if it ever did dry cleaning and they had the Tritecla, whatever that is, stuff in the ground, that's really difficult to deal with. Gas stations, still you need to know and you need to have action. But also within gas stations, there's a state cleanup list. The vast majority of gas stations are on what's called the Superfund list. So that's already kind of been designated aside. And even though it may be dirty, you're not responsible in buying it. So those are things that we'll get into that in the due diligence period, but yes.
Go ahead. Yeah.
I believe these are going to get hung. They're going to take this entire presentation and throw it on the YouTube channel for Raisem. So all of it should be pushed together and we'll make sure that there's some kind of distribution of the slides. Yes. So again, it just depends on where. Let's jump into that when we get into the due diligence period and things to look for or things to be worried about.
But that's a good example of one of the main reps and warranties you see in a commercial contract is an environmental rep and warranty. And you know, that seller has not deposited or released any hazardous substances into on or under the property. And if seller's not willing to make that rep or qualify it to what they actually know, that's going to raise red flags to you. So then you have to consult with your client about, do you want to sign this contract and figure it out in due diligence about what the environmental issue is? Do you get a phase one, potentially a phase two? Or do you walk away from the deal because the seller is not going to give you the rep and the warranty? And the reps and the warranties are important because if that's how you have remedy and recourse against the seller. If they say there is no environmental issues and there are, post closing, you find that out, you can go back on the seller and say, hey, you made a rep that there was no environmental issues, but there was, and you got to fix it, you got to clean it up, you have to indemnify me for it. And so because again, there's no duty to disclose and you can't go back and say, you should have told me, your reps and warranties are going to be your safety net in a commercial deal. The next point, taxes and prorations. So just some things to think about with IRS reporting requirements. If it's a significant deal, you may have to allocate, and I'm by no means a tax attorney or an accountant, but sometimes it is necessary to allocate the purchase price between what did you pay for the real estate, what did you pay for the goodwill of the business, what did you pay for the personal property, and kind of make that allocation to the extent necessary. And the IRS has rules and regs that kind of walk through that. The other thing to think about is reassessments. If you're buying a commercial property from a seller who's owned it for a long period of time, if you're in the residential world, I'm sure you're familiar with the 3% Save Our Homes homestead cap, right? The 3% cap on increase in assessed value from year to year. There's a similar one in the commercial world, both for commercial non-homestead and commercial
Residential non-homestead
there
and
you go.
commercial properties have a 10% annual
Right.
appreciation cap on what they can charge the assessed value and raise it by year. And so, like case in point, and you'll see this is actually applicable to when you're leasing as well. Buildings that have been owned for a very long period of time will often have a lower tax rate. And so when you're in there and you're paying a triple net rate and you see advertised triple net rates, it's really important to understand what the CAM and or operating expenses are as well. So some buildings downtown Sarasota will have $14 pass-through, some will have a $19 pass-through, and some of them will have an $8 pass-through. And the biggest single change factor on that, actually, as of about this year, it's probably insurance, which has gone nuts. But other than that is taxes and when they bought and how they bought, and how well they've kept on top of fighting increases in what those rates are. When you're talking about for your purchaser though, and so this is a rule of thumb and not something you can bank on, but generally speaking, especially in Sarasota County under Bill First, he's going to take the purchase price. The state basically says that he has to charge 85% of that, of the value. He's going to take the purchase price, he's going to multiply it times 0.85, and that's going to be your assessment on the year following the year that you purchased it, right? And so that's important in your analysis that you're doing for your buyers. Hey, you're buying this and you're buying it at a cap rate, and say they are buying a industrial property. Most industrial properties across Sarasota and Manatee County are what they call industrial gross leases, which means that it's a total figure. So if that rate that they're going to be paying in taxes jumps from 45 cents to $1.65 because they're now being assessed. He bought it at $20 a square foot. You're buying it at $185 a square foot because that's where the market is, or $225 if it's a smaller piece. You're paying a huge jump in those taxes, and that's going to eat into the profitability, and you need to be able to display that for your owner. So just something to think about. It's not really a part of the CC5 contract, but definitely something that you need to be thinking about when you're making those offers on behalf of folks. That's the best rule of thumb. And again, so this year, like, so if you're put a contract under, right? So taxes are assessed as to the value on January 1st, right? So then there's no new data point there to come through. So normally you don't see it until the entire next year, right? And so when you're doing your prorations on the worksheet, normally what they're going to do, and this kind of varies. The CC5, I believe, has for it to be reconciled at the end of the year. If it's
Yeah, yeah.
above a certain percentage difference, but basically you're going to take whatever it was the year before in November and this is a caveat that you'll often see get thrown into the seller wants to use the actual tax figure and the buyer normally wants to use the tax figure as though paid in November, right? So that's something that you got to look at and see how it plays into the purchase agreement. When you're working on the seller's behalf or the buyer's behalf, you know which one you're targeting as far as how that gets prorated and what number you're figuring from.
Yeah, and it's a good point. If you're representing a buyer that's gonna buy a plaza with 10 leases and the same owners own that plaza for 20 years, they're gonna have a low assessed value. They're gonna have a low pass through on their operating costs for taxes, right? So your client's gonna purchase that property, they're gonna get reassessed, their taxes are gonna go up, but you buy that property subject to those leases. You know, you can't just automatically terminate and amend leases just because you're the new owner. You take subject to those leases. And we'll talk about estoppels and all that in a
And-
minute as well. But you might you might lose out on profitability because you know it's the prior owner was getting away with an $8 pass through, but your taxes just doubled because it was reassessed. And as Joe said, the property is going to be reassessed as of January 1, the year following the purchase of the property. So if you buy any properties bought this year will be reassessed as of January 1, 2025. So whatever the fair market value of the property is on January 1 of the year following the closing, that's when the assessment's going to take place. And under those statutes, a transfer does trigger a reassessment. So it will be reassessed on January 1 the following year.
So on that, whether it's so I brought up the idea of a modified gross lease, which is fairly common across the industrial side. Even if you have triple net leases, so I had this happen with a buyer that I represented. It was a new development project. They were projecting like a $7.50 CAM on a barrier island up in Reddington Beach. And we purchased that property for $7.5 million. And the owner, or the buyer, was actually quite sophisticated in that allocation process that he referenced earlier. She hired a specialist that then took that and said, hey, a lot of this has to do not with just the real estate, but with the businesses that are in place. And so she had a substantial amount allocated to intangible things, right? So it only got assessed at like 3.7, but that assessment moved it like $3 or $4 a square foot in the total pass through. Well, the leases said, that's great. We pass them all through to the tenants, but then there's the actual capacity of the tenants to absorb that shock. And so even if you have leases that says pass it through and it's someone else's responsibility, if that's going to cause that tenant to go out of business or to fail to be able to pay the rent, or you haven't disclosed that and had that conversation during due diligence, and this leads into the contract too, securing the ability to talk to those tenants, to interact with them and say, hey, I'm going to buy your property. If I buy your property, understand what the implications of that are going to be. It actually has a consequence on their bottom line. And those are things inside that due diligence. Going back to that duty disclose and what you don't get as part of the CC5. If you're not interacting at that level, you're opening yourself up to some risk. And a lot of times the seller won't allow that, incidentally.
And that's why, like, again, I should have put the due diligence next. But jumping into estoppels, that's why it's important to get an estoppel.
Here, let's
Yeah, you can go.
It is next.
You can go ahead.
Great.
Yeah, it was the next one. But jumping ahead to estoppels, most of you are probably familiar with getting an estoppel from like an HOA. Similar, but more different information. You're going to want to get estoppels from every tenant that has a lease in that building, and the estoppel is going to say, because again, your buyer is taking subject to those leases. They want to know what they're buying into and getting themselves into. You want the estoppel is going to say, you know, the landlord's not in default, the tenant's not in default, all amounts have been paid. This is the amount of rent, this is the amount of the security deposit. Attached is a copy of the lease and every single amendment we've ever done. But a lot of times, and that's all good information. And that, to Joe's point, is most of the time what the seller is going to give you as far as communication with the tenant. They don't want you knocking on tenants' doors and saying, I'm going to buy your property, and freaking everybody out that things are going to change. The problem is it takes time to get those estoppels. If the lease doesn't have a provision that requires a tenant to give an estoppel, and the
You're never
tenant's
gonna-
not willing to play ball, you're gonna run into an issue. But usually those estoppels don't come until a few days prior to closing. And so in order to get that information, which is certified, signed by the tenant, that's the purpose of an estoppel. It's to stop the tenant from claiming otherwise when the new owner takes over. So the new owner, your buyer, once he's the owner of the property, can waive the estoppel and say, no, you said your rent was this. You said, you weren't in default. You said X, Y, and Z. That's the purpose of the estoppel. And so again, you usually don't get that information until a few days, a week prior to closing, and that might be too late. You're out of due diligence, to run a profitability analysis. And so if you put in the contract, we need estoppels prior to the end of the due diligence period. If that's an issue and a consideration for your client because it's a 10-tenant building or whatever, that needs to go into the CC5 or whatever contract you're drafting because it's not captured in the form.
Yes.
That,
You absolutely can.
yeah, you
Yeah.
can. It's a contract. You can freely contract for whatever you want. Exactly. It's a negotiation. You would put that if you're gonna stick with the CC5, you'd put that in the additional terms section at the
Section
end.
23.
You'd write that in.
Section 23.
And we'll talk about section 23 too. When you're writing things, one of the things to remember is don't write anything that's going to conflict with the rest of the agreement, because a lot of times I'll get a form contract and it'll have additional terms and it'll have 3 different things and it'll conflict with different provisions of the CC5. And then we all have to scratch our heads and say, well, what's really going on here? Then we have to do another amendment or an addendum to clarify. And so, getting counsel involved, especially on a more sophisticated commercial transaction, is obviously highly advised.
So let's pause on due diligence, because I think it's one of the most, for the reasons that we led with in the difference between a residential contract and a commercial contract and that lack of affirmative responsibility to disclose things. Due diligence is everything in a commercial contract and in a commercial transaction in general. And let's talk about the general things that go into a commercial due diligence. So we led with the idea of environmental. Most of the time, to get a loan to close a commercial transaction, you are going to need a phase 1. It's not generally a big deal if the landlord doesn't make a representation. Normally the guy writing the phase 1 will ask for the seller to sign some kind of representation thing. Even if he doesn't get it, that'll dictate whether he goes if he feels confident in issuing a phase 1 or without doing a phase 2. But so what a phase 1 is the environmental engineer will look at that property. He'll look at the historics around that property. He'll go out and he'll look around the property for, is there an oil can sitting on the ground? Is there any evidence that there's been some kind of industry that's gone on there that would raise concern? Are there any historically, he'll go back in time and look at pictures of that property and see what may or may not have occurred on that property over time. And based off of that, based off of a database that he'll run it against that shows where gas stations were, the state is pretty well plotted out all those things. They've pretty well plotted out where all of the, he'll look at this big database and he'll say, there's no reason to suspect that there are any environmental problems with this. And that's called a phase 1 report. Or the phase 1 report will say, there is good reason to suspect, and here are my reasons, that there are environmental concerns on this. If you get a clean phase 1, you take that to the bank and the bank says, I accept this, and then they finance it. If subsequently to that, it's determined that there's something dirty about that property, that goes, you're kind of absolved. The bank assumes responsibility. It goes against that insurance claim that you would have against that phase 1. So that's generally what you need. You don't need the seller to give that to you. Phase one varies in cost depending on what it is they're looking for. They range anywhere from about $1,800 to as much as $4,000 or $5,000, kind of depending on what it is they're looking at and how much work goes into it. If that phase one comes back and they say, hey, there's something wrong or dirty, or that we suspect that there's something, there'll be some conditional report. Sometimes it's, hey, we need to set a well and run and test the water to see if there's any fuel in it. Or we need to take 3 bearing samples and pull out some dirt and see if there's heavy metals or like whatever that dry cleaning chemical is. So those are the kinds of things that they'll give recommendations on what needs to be done. When I sold the corner of Orange and Main downtown, 40, 50 years ago, there was a gas station there. And they said, hey, there was a gas station there and there was a report that there was a tank here and there's no proof that it was ever gotten out. So we had to go and we had to dig holes in where that tank was supposed to be. Turned out somebody had taken the tank out and never reported it. And then we had to, do some sample tests to see if there was any fuel in the water base table, right? There wasn't. So everything turned out okay, but we had to go through that phase 2 process in order to get a financeable property. So that's one thing. So you have environmental. 2, you have title, and we're going to jump into title a little bit later, but so again, a phase 2 is just a follow-up on something that the phase 1 has identified. It's an actual test of some kind. You're either evaluating soil for something that's not supposed to be there, according to the state of Florida, or water or something. You're testing, you're doing actual tests to figure out what's going on.
If a phase 1 is just a survey looking at aerials and old maps of, was citrus grown here? Was this cattle ranch? A phase 2 is invasive testing. So the phase 1 recommends invasive testing. Right.
No.
No.
If you finance it, most banks are going to require a phase 1 in order to put their money at risk. Yeah, because
So-
you got to remember, even at the point that they take mortgage and then there becomes an issue, you just walk away from whatever your deposit is. They generally will have more than 50% of the problem. And if the cost to clean up exceeds the cost of the mortgage, they're going to walk every time, right? So the bank wants to be protected against that. And the way that they do that is by getting that phase 1 report, and it basically passes that along and says, it's unreasonable for us to have thought of this. We're not responsible for it. Most buyers will. So again, it depends. And again, if you're out if you're in the middle of some property and the guy who bought on this side just got a phase 1 and the one that's on that side, I've had owners that are like, you know what? I'm not worried about it. This has been functionally virgin land out in Lakewood Ranch. I'm not worried about it. That said, it could be so cow pastures have issues from time to time. They used to have what they called cattle dips, right? And so they would literally dig a big hole and fill it with oil. Arsenic they used to treat cows with arsenic in order to keep the fleas and flies off as well. So there are a lot of things that could be. Lots of stuff that was out by the interstate. Although this applies less in Florida with I-75 because of the age, but before you had unleaded gas, the vast majority of lead issues had to do with washways off of roads where you had leaded gas that then would contaminate the oil, and it didn't matter that nothing had ever been there. So there's lots of reasons. As a realtor, what you never want to do is advise somebody not to get a phase 1. It's functionally an environmental inspection.
Yeah, and for most commercial deals, the cost of getting a phase 1 is insignificant to the overall purchase price and potential liability that you will face from federal government under their environmental laws. They're very strict environmental laws, strict liability, meaning doesn't matter if you were at fault or not. If you are the owner of the property that has an environmental issue, they will come after you and you will have to pay damages, penalties, cleanup. And again, going back to representations and warranties, if the seller made some representations that turned out not to be true, you have potential recourse to go back to the seller and say, hey, the federal government's coming after me, but this is your fault. You're on the hook for it. And so kind of out of the scope of what we're talking about, but I would always recommend a phase one because the environmental laws, the Department of Environmental Protection will come after you if there are environmental issues on your property, whether you're the problem, whether you released it or deposited it or not.
So the phase one will, again, when they do their background as part of their phase one research, they'll look at previous uses and then they will take so it's just like a flow chart, right? So if this raises a risk, then they'll say, hey, there's a risk and these phase two things need to be done to validate that this risk that we've identified based off historical use is either no longer a concern or is a concern and requires remediation. Correct. Correct. Yes. So that's a great point, and thank you for bringing it up. Phase one, so typically speaking, I'll let you speak from a legal review. Normally, the phase one, it says the first thing it'll say on the phase one is that it's warranted to the individual that it's prepared for and the bank that's that you name, and that's it. So it's not, and again, this is where, you say, why would anybody do it? I've had people close on properties based off phase ones written by somebody they knew to somebody they knew, and they were buying it cash and they just didn't feel like they needed to have that redundant risk taken care of. And they're like, it's a X $1,000 transaction. And I'm willing to accept that risk. Otherwise, it's only good to those parties, right? So you can make decisions based off of it at your risk. The bank is always going to want another one. If they're not listed on it, it's not valid for them. They'll be outside of the regulators' requirements for them.
And the reason the bank wants it, you might be wondering, why does the bank care? It's because if the bank ever takes the property in foreclosure and they become the owner of the property, they don't want to get hit with any environmental issues.
And it's a requirement if it's a federal FDIC insured bank, it's actually a requirement for loans above a certain transaction value that they show proof of that. So it's a compliance issue for their portfolio. Okay. So we've got environmental more or less covered as deep as we're going to go, I think, in this class on the environmentals. So what else is it that during due diligence that we're looking at? So you see surveys and zoning. So survey during due diligence, again, they're selling you a legal description that they put on, and we kind of glossed over that. I don't know if it's later in the brief, but let's go ahead and address it right now. When you go to why don't you address how to pull a proper legal description?
Yeah, so there's a slide later on about best practices for legal description. At Joe's recommendation to kind of talk about this. So, you're gonna skip to it. Keep going. There you go. So best practices. So really with legal descriptions, there's two different types. There's meets and bounds, which are the longer legal descriptions where it says commence at the southwest corner of the north quarter of the south half of the township range, right? That's meets and bounds, and that's where you really have to rely on a surveyor to plot those points out to give you your boundary of what you are buying. And the other one is a plat condo description, the 2-sentence, lot 3 per, per the condo per plat there, recorded thereof. And so when you are preparing a contract or filling in the contract, a lot of times I'll see just the PIDs being used, the property identification number, which that just relates to how the property tax office is assessing the property. It's not a substitute for a legal description. I always like to include it along with my legal descriptions, and you see it referenced on deeds as well. But it's just as an extra backup, as this is the property we're talking about, but it is not a valid legal description. I would also advise against just copy and pasting the legal description from the property appraiser's website, because it's often truncated and abbreviated and not the real legal description. The best thing to do is to take the legal description from the vesting deed. And the vesting deed is the deed that your seller took title. And so when they were the grantee, when they were the buyer, what was the legal description on that? Because the seller, when they go to sell it, when they can't sell you more than they have. And so you want to use the legal description that was on the vesting.
Where would they find that?
So if you go on Sarasota County and Manatee County Property Appraiser website, are probably some of the best property appraisers websites in the state, because I've looked at almost all of them as far as navigating and getting to the deeds and getting to the recorded documents. So all deeds are public record, right? They're recorded in the official records. So you can, the easiest way to do it is to go to the property appraiser's website, whether that's Sarasota County or Manatee County. You go to you put in the address, you put in the property ID, you find the property information page. And if you scroll down, you'll see conveyances or transfers, and you'll see the OR, the official record, book and page or instrument number of all the deeds. You click it, it hyperlinks it to the deed. And so that's the easiest way to do it. And you pull it up, and even if it's a PDF, you pull it up and, do a snippet of it and just copy and paste it as the legal description. So that's the best way to get a legal description, is what was in the vesting deed. It's not going to be a huge issue if you have a contract that you just put the property ID and everybody signs it, do an amendment, get the right legal description, do an amendment, and it's easily rectified. On the point of the surveys, though, the reason the surveys are important in a commercial transaction is because you're either dealing with lots, a huge 100-acre piece of vacant land, it's oddly shaped, or you're dealing with multiple parcels and you're conveying 3 separate parcels that you're going to combine into one. So you're taking these 3 separate legal descriptions and then combining them into one. And so you really need to work with a surveyor to get your legal descriptions. And so at the end of the day, what you want is the contract, the vesting deed, the legal on your title commitment, and the legal on your survey. You want them all to match. You don't want there to be any discrepancies. We've run into quite a few issues with legal descriptions and having to get surveyors certified that it's, even though it's incorrect, it's still the same, getting corrective deeds. And so it's just extra steps before closing that you're going to have to run around and get. So surveys, very important. Generally sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, so from a practical standpoint, in putting in your legal description too, if you can't find that, or you put in the address, you put in thing, you can also put in your additional comments, formal legal description to be verified by buyer's attorney within X days of contract, right? So you can kind of pass that buck along and have that. Again, with the survey, when you're setting your due diligence time period, the surveys, especially right now, especially for a complicated land survey where it's a larger piece of property, or maybe it's downtown where you've got both Bradenton and Sarasota have a lot of easements and drops and different things that could affect that. That can take a while, and the number of survey people, it's a lot more difficult to find somebody who can do a Alta survey on a piece of commercial property than it is to get somebody who can run a survey on a pre-platted home in Lakewood Ranch or fill in the blank neighborhood. So
we'll usually put that the legal description will be confirmed by the survey, and then it ties to whenever your survey.
Yeah, you can do it a number of different ways. And
You can do by the
again,
end of
that due diligence time period, and we talked about this at the very beginning, but if you look at your due diligence in here, it says the key words that you want to focus in on that is absolute and sole discretion. So your due diligence in a commercial contract, eh,
7.
it's in seven,
7.
line 127, right? So it says in buyer's sole and absolute discretion. And that means that literally up till the time that due diligence is over, the buyer can wake up, decide they have a bad hair day and cancel the contract with no penalty whatsoever. You have to give them all their money back. It's functionally the free look period. And it's common in commercial transactions, right? So in residential, there's normally up to whatever, and then the seller has the right to rectify and all these other things. In commercial, it's not so. I mean, if there was one single difference between the two contracts, I think makes the most, you can walk away for any reason as long as you're in that due diligence period. It depends on the complexity of the deal and the competition for that property. So in a very heated market with a parcel that you're going to have multiple bids and this, that, and the other on, they're going to be looking for a very small due diligence period. Or they may require some kind of compensation for the time that they're bringing it off of the market within the CC5 contract. But I have had, so the longest I've ever had due diligence run, and it was through a number of extensions, was 1,200 days. The shortest is, probably 15 days, right? Except for that one that was as is, right? But the average tends to be 60 to 180 days. Land tends to be the longest. And that's a great segue into my next thing, zoning analysis. So this is a huge deal within the commercial transaction sector, where it's not so much in residential. You pretty much, it's zoned residential. The question is how many families can be on that lot? And maybe can I Airbnb it, right? So you have two things you have to answer with most residential deals. Within commercial, there are all kinds of shades of use. And when you're buying a property, as you remember, you're buying the land, you're buying the structure on the land, you're buying the entitlements that go with that. And zoning is a huge part of that entitlements within construction or within commercial, right? So if I buy in downtown core in downtown Sarasota, I have a right to 10 stories and 50 units an acre. That has a lot of value. Most of the land in downtown Sarasota over the last 20 years has sold not on location, but on how many units can I put there, which is a combination of location. If I go to downtown edge, that drops to 20 units an acre, right? But then there's overlays that deal with that then, if I'm an overlay, then I'm in for workforce housing, or there was a Rosemary overlay that shot that up to 75 units an acre, provided you were under 5 stories in height. And there was all of these different nuances. This is a huge part of what makes commercial, I think, fun and interesting, but also a little bit complicated and something that you need to delve into. That zoning analysis and suitability, never, ever, ever, no matter if you sold it once before and you got a zoning declaration, never make that representation yourself as a realtor. Just don't do it. Let this guy and his legal background put it on his insurance. Your E&O will not cover it, and you will find you're not allowed to make zoning determinations as a realtor. Your E&O will not cover that, and you will end up in a lawsuit and in a bad spot. So while you can say this is what the zoning reads, and you can provide that information. I do that a lot. I mean, a lot of the value that I add is in talking how a property can be used and thinking about often the ways that I find buyers is by looking at the property from a different angle and going and grabbing a buyer whose profile is different than the current valuation is being based off of. And that's where the money gets made, right? So you can provide that value. You just can't represent it. Does that make sense? Okay. So that's the zoning analysis portion, and that's really important. there's two more sections that you're going to have to do in due diligence. You got environmental, you have the survey and what land it actually is. You have the uses that you're allowed on it. Then you have the condition of the property. And this is really not much different than what you would get out of as a residential, what do you call them? Home inspection, right? So this is, but with buildings and depending on the complexity of the building, is it a tower in downtown Bradenton or Sarasota? Is it a warehouse that's metal? Like there's a different level. I generally, do we have any home inspectors in the, I never have a home inspector do your commercial survey because like the home inspectors think their number one thing is to like come up with this long list of stuff that's wrong with the property, right? And that's how they prove their value. 95% of that doesn't apply to a lot of commercial buildings. If you are selling a $25 million tower downtown, you're going to need you're going to hire an engineering firm. They're going to come in and they're going to do an evaluation of the systems. They're going to give you average time left, this, that, and the other. That'll also play in. Often you're going to talk to your buyer. A lot of times during that process, they're going to want all of those assessed so that they can do commercial, I don't know if you're aware, but commercial depreciates at a different schedule to the residential, right? So it's 39.5 years versus 27 years. And so it's not as valuable, but during that process, a lot of buyers will get a cost segregated analysis of the individual components. And then you can depreciate like your air conditioning on a lot of those larger big ticket components much faster, which works on the cash flow when you're when you're going through that. But so that's the next big thing that you're going to target and get done during the due diligence period is that physical structure of the building, of the parking lot, of the other things that you do that are related to that. A lot of stuff like out in Lakewood Ranch, you buy some of those pieces of property, it comes with all of the rights, duties, and obligations of that piece of property. In order to get a commercial piece of property, a lot of developers had to preserve a wetland or guarantee or maintain a wetland. You need to understand what your obligations are vis-a-vis that wetland that is adjacent on the parcel. You're like, oh, look, it come with a private preserve. It also came with the responsibility to maintain that private reserve. And the government gets to tell you how you have to do that. So that's kind of the end of that piece. Did you have anything to add to that?
I can add, yeah, I mean, I could add to it. So I mean, just kind of big picture, the intended use is going to govern what your due diligence is. Due diligence is anything you want it to be. And I know the CC5 kind of goes through and specifies during the due diligence period, you can do A, B, C, D, E, F, G. You don't even have to do that. You can just say the buyer is going to inspect the property to ensure it's, going to meet its intended use. And whatever that intended use is, I think to your point earlier, changing from industrial to something different, you're going to want to know, can you do it? Can you do that use? So that's where the zoning analysis comes in. The survey is going to tell you a lot of information. It doesn't only give you your legal description, but I'm sure you're all familiar with the title commitment and the B2 exceptions. When you're dealing with a commercial piece of property, you're going to get a lot more B2 exceptions for random FPL easements, easements that the prior owners have given away for access. Oil, gas, and mineral rights come up a lot. So somebody's got the right to come back on your property and explore for oil, gas, and minerals. And the surveyor is going to plot that all out. Where is it? Does it run diagonally through the whole parcel, meaning you can't do anything unless you get that easement extinguished? And if it's a 100-year-old easement, who do you go to? Can you even get that, extinguished? So there's a whole lot of considerations, and the survey is one of the best tools you're going to have in a commercial project that's going to show you all the potential issues with the property. Going back to inspections of the building, if you're not buying vacant land and you're buying a piece of property with a structure on it, one of the things I think about is, is it in compliance with the codes? Is it in compliance with the Americans with Disabilities Act? Because those are issues and violations that your buyer will inherit and have to deal with. I've had a couple buyers inherit fire code violations where they had to retrofit a plaza to bring it up to code for fire. They got a building inspection, but they didn't point that out, but they had to go and retrofit a few units that weren't up to code when they went to go release or release them, and the new tenants were doing their new build out. It was found out that the fire systems weren't up to code. Client was rehabbing a hotel and got red tagged because all the quote unquote life safety systems would deal with all the fire regulations for hotels, fire rated doors, specific signs, this and that, weren't up to code. Again, going back to reps and warranties, get them from your seller. If your seller isn't going to give you it, it's a red flag, and you take the risk and sign the contract and figure it out in due diligence, or you walk away from the deal. Segueing into conditions to closing, we all familiar with the concept that after due diligence is over, your money is hard, right? Your deposit is hard. It's non-refundable. The CC5 doesn't really expressly make this clear, although, just like a FAR bar, I think everybody's kind of the opinion. But that deposit should be hard unless the buyer defaults. The buyer shouldn't be able to default after the due diligence period to be able to keep their deposit. And so we always have a carve out for, yeah, it's hard except for a buyer default, or for a specified failure or a failure to satisfy a specified condition to closing. And with a commercial deal, because you're going to have not only 60 or 90 days commonly due diligence period, it's not a 7 or 10 day period like you have in a residential. You're going to have on average 30, 60, 90 day due diligence period. But on top of that, you're going to have a list of specific items that must be satisfied before closing can occur. And so you can get out of due diligence, like for a vacant land deal, for example, if you're going to have to rezone the property and you're going to have to get permits and you're going to have to get a preliminary plat approved, and there's a whole bunch of permits and approvals that you're going to need in order to feel comfortable spending the millions and millions of dollars to buy this big piece of land. You're going to go out of due diligence. The seller's not going to want you to stay in due diligence for 2 years, but your due diligence is going to come to an end, but you're going to have kind of a safety net. You're going to say, yeah, we're out of due diligence, but as buyer, my obligation to close and buy the property is still conditioned on A, B, and C, getting final zoning approval, getting plat approval, whatever it is, because even though the buyer's out of due diligence, if that condition does not occur or is not satisfied through no fault of the buyer is going to be able to, even if it's a year after due diligence is over, the buyer is going to be able to say, sorry, I can't close. I didn't get what I needed for my intended use. I'll take my deposit and walk. Thank you very much. Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
That's
So one of the things,
one of,
so you're rarely in deals like that, you're rarely going to use a CC5 first. Or if you do, you're going to have like a 5-page addendum that comes along with it. So I've done a lot of racetracks and Wawas and really any single use retail tenant. Just about the way that industry generally works is they close 10 days after they get approval and permit in hand to move forward on construction of their stuff. So they do all of their due diligence up to the point where the government actually issues them the right to build it. And that's when they'll close on the property. So they tie you up, and the 1,200 day one is similarly, if you're working with like a workforce housing developer, they get all their approvals, then they have to go and they actually secure the funds. It's part of they have approval of the government. They submit that, they get all of that checked off. Then they submit it to the state and they get state funding, and within state funding, then within X number of days, they close. So those, in my experience, those are the 2 longest lead times. And when I said that due diligence extended 1,200 days, really it was the additional zoning criteria to close within the due diligence. It was a limited out within that due diligence period from that point forward.
and to your point, what I find just from a personality perspective is different between residential and commercial deals is with a commercial deal, everybody wants to close, and they're generally willing to work with you to get the deal done. The seller wants to make a bunch of money on the sale, and the buyer thinks the land's going to be profitable. Everybody's working towards the same goal. I did a little bit of residential before I moved into commercial, and it seemed like almost every time people were looking for an out. Attorneys and brokers were looking for an out. Like buyers got cold feet. They don't want to close. Oh, this inspection shows that. And it was almost like you were fighting to get the deal done. My mortgage is more than I thought it was going to be, et cetera. And so when you're dealing with, an amendment or cooperation between the parties, usually you're going to find that there is cooperation between the parties. The seller may not want to spend any money cooperating with the buyer. So if the seller's got to go out and hire somebody or incur any expense, they're going to pass that on to the buyer. And, that's a fair ask. But generally, you'll find that the parties want to get the deal done and close. And I found in my limited experience doing residential, that wasn't always the case. And so it's kind of a more harmonious relationship in a commercial transaction. Foreign owned?
It's not that much different. So you have the FIRTPA or whatever. It's really about if it's, actually they just added something here in Florida and they just have to sign that waiver. But then in addition to that, for the loan, your lender will go through some additional hoops. And that's really covered in the financing part though.
And
But-
just to clarify, when you're saying the business is foreign owned, so we're not talking about buying businesses, but we're talking about buying the property. But you're talking about if the seller is a foreign entity. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. You have your FIRPTA affidavit, the foreign investment affidavit, which the IRS requires, the new Foreign Entities Conveyance Act that Florida just passed. So just some affidavits really will cover it.
So I want to bring up one more thing. So the last kind of due diligence thing that we really wanted to hit on. So we've gone through all the things that deal with the property. Many, especially if it's an investment property, many commercial transactions, at the end of the day, what you're buying is an income stream, right? And so that goes back to that estoppel idea, the garnering of the rent roll, the analysis of the leases, and that is also got to be done within that due diligence period and or carved out with specific caveats for continued follow-up. Tenant estoppels, which are not required in the CC5 for them to give you. Additionally, like he said,
I thought there was a section.
I think you're right. I'm sorry.
think
It is in the CC5. But if it's not in the leases, the landlord can't actually deliver a tenant signed estoppel. And so what you'll often get is a seller estoppel.
A landlord.
Warranty or landlord.
A landlord estoppel.
Landlord estoppel, warranting that this is the lease, that this is the entire lease and these are the terms. That can come back and like that's effective to some degree and go back, but it doesn't actually get you that income stream going again. It just opens them up to litigation. So the more time you can spend in that and understanding what the actual obligations of the lease are and what they aren't. And the other thing I'll just throw out, it'll save you a lot of heartburn if you ever do this within your estoppels, whether or not there's an option, because sometimes it gets cloudy in reading through the leases, whether there's an option remaining, putting that there are 0 options remaining or 1 option that starts from this time to that time and having them sign that. I have used that as a property management side of our business many times to go back to the tenant and say, nope, you don't have an option. And they're like, no. Because in commercial leases, you'll often have an extension and an option are almost interchangeably used, but they're legally different. And a lot of folks don't document it properly. And so they'll say they extended it. And then the tenant will say, well, I extended it and I still have my option. And the landlord, no, that extension was your option. And so it gets cloudy. But it's one of those things that if you can clear that up in the estoppels, is really helpful. But verifying that cash flow, showing your buyer that they can expect that cash flow, evaluating it for what is the probability of each individual tenant to be able to make those payments as they think that they are. That's where you look into what is the pass-through expenses and taxes or insurance expected to change? How is this going to be interpreted? How does this change the cash flow? There's a lot of analysis that goes into a good commercial deal, investment deal at that level that gets knocked out at that due diligence period. And it's important that as you go through all of that and as you assist your buyer through all of that, again, you're not guaranteeing anything. You're just putting together Proformas at the bottom of your proforma, it all ought to have something along the lines of, while the information contained herein is secured from sources deemed reliable, it's neither guaranteed nor warranted, or something along those lines, right? So as you do the work, every step along the way and everything that we do other than the contract, and you're just filling in lines, you want to make sure that as a realtor, you're not doing the lawyer's work, right? And anytime that you send them stuff, if they've employed a lawyer, you want to CC the lawyer and say, but the lawyer needs to check for legal, right? And that's your out.
Yeah, and that's actually yeah, the property tax is a statutorily required disclosure too, but it's just in the same vein, right? The same idea as the tax roll, and that I think plays into one of the things you'll want to get. I can't recall if the CC5 calls for any property documents, but in a commercial deal, what I'll usually say is within 5 days after the effective date, I want this list of property documents, due diligence items, whatever they call it. And some sellers will set up like a Dropbox where they'll throw all the leases, they'll throw the rent roll. And that's basically the seller saying, here's the information that I have and I'm sharing it with you. And so in that, you'll get the leases, you'll want to review the leases. A big difference between residential and commercial is to the extent you want to do it, or you're trying to offset legal costs to just do a review for your client, or you want to get involved. I have some brokers that really get into reviewing the leases and saying, hey, here's this issue. Look, what does this mean? Look at it. But leases, B2 exception documents, somebody needs to read those documents, because in the leases, you'll find options, extensions, rights of first refusal that are unrecorded. And so title insurance isn't going to pick them up because they're unrecorded, but you're taking subject to the lease. So if you buy a property that's subject to an unrecorded right of first refusal in a lease, get ready for some litigation and probably a loss of the property for your buyer, because they're going to, if the property was sold without properly waiving that right of first refusal, there's going to be an issue there. All the B2 documents, if there's easements, if there are, there are for commercial properties, especially for these plazas, declarations of covenants, easements, restrictions, saying, what you can and can't do on the property. A lot of those, is NIMBY still a phrase that is used? Not in my backyard, so those undesirable uses, they're going to be excluded. Going back to Wawa and a lot of these single-use tenants, if there's a Wawa on the property, there's probably a use restriction where you can't have sandwiches, you can't have coffee, you can't have, if there's a Starbucks, they're going to have coffee and tea restrictions. And so if you're trying to buy an out parcel in that plaza that's subject to those restrictions, somebody needs to really review those, because that's not going to be found in zoning. Zoning's going to let you do it, but there's going to be a private restriction that says you can't do it. So you don't want to have your client buy a piece of property thinking they can put something there that they ultimately cannot.
Most of those documents he was just talking about, with the exception of the stuff that is private, or in that lines 166 to 179.
Okay.
That's where most of that is dealt with within the CC5 contract. The other individual clause I want to bring you guys' attention to is if you'll turn to line 240 and 241. And this is important, because this is one of the things this is one of the most common things that we see struck through by a seller's attorney, and that's the seek specific performance, item 2 on line 240 and 241. And this deals with, if somebody goes into default, is there something more at risk for the buyer than their deposit, right? So if they put up $150,000 or $500,000, is that the sum total of their risk if they walk away? Unless you strike through on the CC5, seek specific performance, it's not. The seller can literally sue you to close. Whether you can actually get it done or not is another story that I don't want to go into, but that's an important thing to recognize. A lot of times you'll see that struck.
Yeah, for a buyer default, you usually won't see the courts granting specific performance in favor of a seller, forcing a buyer to buy the property. It's the opposite direction. It's if it's the seller defaults and won't close, the buyer will want specific performance, which is basically asking the court to tell the seller to follow the terms of the contract and specifically perform the contract and sell the property and close. But Joe's right. If you don't strike that, if specific performance isn't in the contract, you're
This is
likely not
specifically
going to
with the
get
buyer,
it.
though.
But-
This is specifically a default of the buyer.
So
Yeah.
on which,
That clause specifically deals with the buyer default and the seller being able to sue
Right,
for
or take
specific
deposits.
performance. So that's often struck in my experience. I'd say maybe over half of the contracts, when it gets in front of the buyer's attorney, they want me to strike that portion.
yeah, usually what we see specific performance, and again, this is where the CC5 isn't as robust as other commercial contracts, because you have post-closing obligation, you have pre-closing obligations to, close, you have, pre-closing obligations could be, the buyer could have to perform some obligation before closing. Making deposits is a pre-closing obligation, but then you could have post-closing obligations. And so really where we see specific performance is post-closing obligations, where it's after closing, your only real remedy is to have the court force the buyer to do whatever he said he was going to do under the contract. Let's say there was a permit that was supposed to be transferred into the buyer's name within 30 days after closing, and the buyer doesn't do that. That would be something the court would give specific performance for. I haven't really ever seen a court grant specific performance forcing the buyer to buy the property. So specific performance is just a general remedy where you want the court to specifically enforce the contract. And normally we see that with post-closing obligations. I think we go back one more. There was one more. I think we'll skip the first vacant land. So just the last slide of differences, closing documents. So a lot of times you'll see generally in a commercial contract bill of sale for all the personal property, which is the non-real property. Anything, the deed is going to transfer you the real property in the structure they're on, but it's the personal property. Are there printers inside? Are there equipment inside? A general bill of sale saying, hey, all the personal property that I have, I'm giving to you, buyer. And it's just usually a 1 or 2 page document that says this, you're getting all the personal property. And any sort of assignments of all the leases. If you're the buyer, you want an assignment of all the leases. So you can basically step into the shoes of the landlord's seller and enforce the lease. And then like I was just talking about post-closing obligations, you'll see a lot of times with commercial deals, there could be on the buyer or seller side post-closing obligations, whether it's cleaning something up, reprorations, whatever it is. If there are things that you want to be done after closing and ahead of time that you want them to be done after closing, make it a post-closing obligation. And most of the time you're going to do a post-closing agreement, because if it's not in the contract and you close, good luck getting your seller to agree to anything. They're going to say, I completed the contract, performed all my obligations, I don't owe you anything. And they're right. And a lot of you have probably seen in I think it's in all the contracts, even the residential one, this provision does not survive, or this provision survives closing and shall not be merged into the deed. There's a reason it says that, is because when a contract closes and the deed is delivered to the buyer, everything in the contract merges into the deed. It's called the merger doctrine. So basically all rights, remedies, liabilities, everything to do with that contract merges into the deed, and you can't go back and sue on it unless there's a provision that says, hey, this provision survives. It's not going to be merged into the deed, or you've established a post-closing agreement that says this is going to be handled post-closing. And a lot of times you'll see, cooperation, further assurances, those kinds of clauses in contracts survive in closing. Sometimes, going back to reps and warranties, it sounds counterintuitive, but you'll say, I'll give you this representation, but it's only going to survive for a year after closing. I mean, we're only getting like 6 months, 180 days now for survival of reps. So the buyer has to find out that the rep was untrue within 180 days, or else they can't go back and sue on it. So kind of the negotiation point of, yeah, we'll give you this rep, but you only have a limited time after closing to come sue us if you ever find out that it's false.
And when you're working with a large corporate entity or a REIT or something, it's like 60 days, best case scenario. Most of the time, they're not going to make any warranties or reps. They just, hey, we bought it this way without any guarantees, warranties, or reps. You do your due diligence and
Yeah.
you buy it. And so I would say that as we're giving you a lot of warnings and what ifs and this, that, and the other, but kind of like when you're working with a spec buyer who's, flipping a house, there's an inherent risk in commercial property. You're buying income streams, you're buying it with the intent of making a profit on the property. And that comes with risk above and beyond that of, hey, I want to occupy a house for the next 8 to 7 years and then sell it. And I'm living here. So my backfill is I always have a use for it.
And
So
going back to the beginning, the reason there isn't a duty to disclose is because it's assumed that if you're engaging in a commercial transaction, you are sophisticated. You are a sophisticated party. You understand risks and you understand the analysis and you understand what needs to be done in order to buy the property. And so that's why there's not as many protections for the everyday home buyer who's just buying a property because they need a home. And so I think this does lead in a good segue into the different types of deeds. Okay, sorry. No. Again, at Joe's, Joe is super helpful in kind of letting me know what realtors and brokers may want to know. So just very, very quickly, in residential, you see almost every single time you'll get a warranty deed. In the commercial world, you'll see most often than not a special warranty deed. So not to go all law school, but in a warranty deed, there are 6 warranties that are implied. They're not stated. And Florida has a statutory form warranty deed. States like California don't have a statutory form. So it's section 689.02. That's the statutory form warranty deed that, double time, every attorney, all your closing software is going to show. That's the statutory form warranty deed. And that basically is a warranty that the seller is going to basically defend against title going all the way back to the beginning of time. So if there's any title issues, of course, you're also getting title insurance in every transaction, but the seller itself is representing in the deed that that title is good, that they'll defend against any claims, that you have the right to enjoy the property, that the seller has the right to sell the property. So there's all these implied warranties in a warranty deed. In a special warranty deed, all of that is there, except what the seller is saying is the seller is going to say, I'm only going to protect you from title defects during my period of ownership. I'm not going all the way back. In a quitclaim deed, is no warranties. Quitclaim is whatever I have. I mean, I could do a quitclaim deed for your house right now. Whatever I have, you have it now. And so a quitclaim deed is really used between spouses and to clear up title corrective deeds. But you don't really ever want to buy a property, and you're not going to get title insurance on a quitclaim deed. So I think if you go to the next slide, I copy and pasted the language. Just let me just go through this. And so just so you can see the difference between what I'm talking about between the language and a statutory deed, statutory form warranty deed in 689.02. So you'll see that it says said party of the first part, which is the grantor, does hereby fully warrant title to said land and will defend same against all lawful claims of all persons whomsoever. So that means all the way, going back all the way through time to whenever the first deed was done, if there's any issues that come up in title, I'm going to defend the new owner against that. The special warranty deed, and you'll see that I have it underlined, that's kind of, they list out, I am protecting you against all the normal warranties that are implied. But if you read the last sentence, it says that the grantor hereby fully, and this isn't a statutory form, this is just a form that has been generated just from attorneys doing it over and over again. But that the grantor fully warrants title to property and will defend same against the lawful claims of all persons claiming by, through, or under the grantor, but against none other. So they're not going all the way back. They're only going to say, hey, if there was any issues that came up when I was the owner, I'm going to defend you against that, but not going all the way back. And so that's really the difference between a special warranty deed and a statutory form warranty deed. And again, a quitclaim deed, you're not getting any warranties at all. No.
Neither would apply there. So that's what's in the property or on the property. This has to do with ownership of the property, right? So deeds are really about,
Well, there's a difference between a title defect and issues with the property themselves. A storage tank on the property isn't going to be a title defect. If there was an unrecorded easement that allowed the gas company to access that storage
That would be
tank, that's a title defect. And so that's sometimes, there's kind of a thin line between what's a title defect and what's just, a use defect. Like the zoning doesn't allow me to do what I want to do. Well, that's not a title defect.
let me give you an example of an issue that I had with Title One. So we did a development downtown Sarasota. We put a building on the end of the garage, and the city sold us a parcel that they owned, and then they actually sold us another parcel directly adjacent to it, which had previously been part of a park. And we were going to put up a park liner building that kind of covered up the Northern Trust garage and opened up onto that public park. They sold it to us. We went through this plans thing and then we got rights to bridge the alleyway in between with the second floor. And it was a really neat project that we put together. The owner of the Northern Trust building came back and said, hey, there was an easement, this road that then became a park, had an easement that it could be used for municipal purposes and no other. And it was deeded over to the city by the railroad for either conveyance of transportation and or public use. You no longer are using it as public use. You've sold it to a private individual, and therefore I get half of that, right? I'm the adjacent landowner. It was originally an easement for rail, for transportation and or public use. It's no longer being used in one of those ways. And so they sued. Our title company went back and forth with them. We ended up getting cashed out by the city, who then just decided to keep it as a park and get angry at the Northern Trust owner. But like, that's an example of like where ownership and where easements and ownership and that kind of complex web, even though we had really good attorneys on all sides, there was different interpretations. And while we feel like we probably could have or should have won, at the end of the day, the city, who had signed that against all lawful persons whomsoever, they said, you know what? We would rather just give you your money back and keep this apart, because we're getting feedback on that side and we're getting feedback on this side. And we didn't want to get in an argument with the city, because that's never productive, right? So we just gave them the land back and got our money back.
Yeah, and again, sounds like that was a document that was in the record, in the public record. It would have showed up as a B2 exception. And again, somebody needs to read. It sounds like there was some sort of reverter where the ownership reverted back to a prior owner or the adjacent owner.
Went back to like a 1906 thing that
Yeah,
didn't show
just-
up post 1980.
Yeah, it's a
big, anyhow.
Yeah, like a
that's the
revert-
kind of
right.
the
So
thing that those either do or don't feed against.
And so in that case, if you see that before you close, you'll want to take action to, get comfortable with that, whether that's, and working with the title company is really important too, to say, what do you need to remove this as an exception? What do we need to do to get this off? Or, if title company's not going to take it off as an exception, how are you going to get your client comfortable with that? Is there some sort of separate agreement where, this transaction isn't going to trigger it? Is it a release or an extinguish of that document? And so there's always a potential answer. It's whether you're going to get there. But that's why reading the B2 documents are so important in a commercial deal. You need to basically read every single page of those documents to see how your property is affected.
All right, we got about 3 or 4 minutes left. I'm open to any additional questions. Yes. So the CC5 is your Swiss Army knife, right? So there's a vacant land contract as well that's commonly used, but the CC5 is by far and away the most common contract that is used. And again, over half my deals will have some kind of lawyer addendum to this, and many commercial contracts do not use a Florida realtor form.
I've maybe used that twice.
I've used it on more than half of mine, but it's often heavily addended.
So it's like.
So what I would, if I was you, yeah, you can use that one, but what I would do is I would identify a good attorney that will represent them, that will hold escrow for them, that will do all of those functions and will review it. Identify them early as a buyer rep, and then work with them on whatever contract or form that they're most comfortable. Yep. You can also execute a deal by creating what's called a letter of intent,
Yeah.
right? And you can cover the business points and then give that over to the lawyers to then craft the contract, okay?
Yeah, no, of course, I'm that guy. Yeah, that's.
And he can do a great job.
I think it's,
Did they put it on there?
they put it, I don't think they did.
We'll get the list and make sure we email our contact information out to
Yeah,
everybody.
I think
in the
I may
room.
have some, I'm horrible with business cards. I think I have some in my car.
Yes.
So I can pass them on. But
No, I use a CC5 actually a lot, and I've closed a $17 million deal on a simple CC5 with no addendum. Right? So is it common? No, but I have. And it depends on the complexity of the property and what you need to do. And again, how long the due diligence is and what's done within that. So it's not a bad contract. It's a very fair middle of the road contract. It does not have the ability unless you put a lot of additional comments, and there is a way that you can add to that as well. But to cover all of the nuances that many different commercial deals will require. And often when you're working again with the attorney that's representing either the buyer or the seller, they have their preferred form that they like to use. And so often that's what dictates it more than the unsuitability of this contract. It's just, they look at their customer and they go, yeah, I can do that, but I'm more familiar with my form. It'll
Right.
cost you less money. And
Right.
then boom, you're
Yeah.
off in a new route.
I wouldn't carte blanche say I'm never going to use it, because I want to take into account the client's, what's the value of the property? If it's just like a $500,000 purchase and the client doesn't have a lot of resources, I don't want to, I don't want to overcharge the client if using the CC5 will do. Like I said, I've used it a couple of times because it's worked, and we can supplement it with an addendum. But for the most part, we have a form, especially if you have corporate clients. They have we have a form that we use. So I'm just more familiar with our forms than the standard CC5.
The value of the CC5, especially when you're doing like a transactional deal and you're on both sides, is that it's not either lawyer's form, right? And so an addendum, they see what they're changing and the other side does too, because most commercial oriented real estate attorneys in Florida will have familiarity with this contract, and they'll be able to easily pick out of the other person's side what it is they're trying to change. And it just kind of cuts through the essence to enable both sides attorneys to go, oh, they're not trying to sneak something through because I know this is the standard.
Yeah.
Here's what they're changing. I reject that. I accept that. I'm okay with that or not. Now, they'll tell you they read every single form, and I'm sure good lawyers do, but things slip through the crack when you're using private forms because there's no consistency or standard to it.
So if everything in place, counsel, of course, the safest course of action, but is there, much like, for example, with the farm, or there are A through L, and then is there a library of similar such riders or doesn't harm?
Yeah, so if you look at the last page of the contract, it'll have a number of different optional clauses that you can put in there. And the one that I was going to call out on that is the 1031. So if you're representing a buyer, especially a buyer who's selling something else and buying this, often they'll want to 1031. A 1031 is simply the ability to forego your tax consequence until later and to transfer your equity without paying a tax consequence. If you don't check that and you don't have that, you're not securing your buyer's rights to that. So that's
Or the-
probably
or the
by far and
seller's
away the
rights.
most common, or the
You-
seller.
Or the seller's rights, or who want to reinvest the proceeds from the sale into another piece of property and not have to pay the capital gains tax on that. Right. Yeah, going back to the LOI, most of the contracts I draft come in through, hey, here, we got this LOI that's signed, this letter of intent. And that tells me I just plug it into my forms, or, tells me everything I need to know. What's the closing date? What's the deposits? How much time for title? How much time for survey?
It's the business points, right?
Right.
Your main job is to protect the business points of your customer. It's the lawyer's job to protect them from the legal consequences.
And I,
Now, the more transactions that you do, the more you can help supplement that and shepherd the process like you do with your residential, where your hands on everything. But if you get a good commercial real estate attorney, they're going to have suffered through that and they'll be able to make up that gap.
I think talking with your client about what do they need, what do they want to do, are they gonna have to go through a 6-month zoning analysis or a rezone? Then you're gonna know what are the issues and will a CC5 work, and then you can reach out to your attorney and say, hey, this is the deal I got going on. Here are the deal points. Do you think a CC5 as is or with an addendum will work, or do we need something else? And so you can get that ball rolling. So you're not calling the attorney saying, hey, can you draft me a contract tomorrow for it? Because it's not always possible to just say, yeah, let me whip up a contract, by the next day. I think right. If you just want to make the introduction and I then have the attorney talk directly with the buyer, that's
We're-
an option. Yeah.
We're gonna go ahead and terminate the whole thing, and he'll be up here to answer some questions. I actually have to run. I've got a 4 o'clock closing in Sarasota. So, but thanks everybody. Appreciate your time. I hope this has been useful for you guys.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. I don't.
Okay.
Hey, great job.
Thank you.
You did a really good job.
Let's
Thank
get
you.
lunch sometime.
Yeah.
It's not mine.
It's not mine, that's fine.
It's not mine either. I'm at
Dan,
the
if he
car.
wants to get a photo op real quick.
Oh
I
yeah.
don't. I'm a terrible realtor.
Yeah.
But I actually, so. Really quick.
Thanks.
No, like I said, I just won't. They're gonna send me.
Yeah, I'm gonna get
Because
that
I
whole
work
list
with
and
an
I'll send
attorney,
out
it's with my
emails,
residential
thank you in the group.
Right.
And I commercial.
Mhm.
She sound more.
I gotta run. Thank you.
I just do commercial and, I do a lot of more vacant land,
Yeah.
hotel. So I do more higher end deals, not just the